Hi, everybody. It's always really nice to be here in the trust space. I have been a bit migratory this year, spending time between LA and here, and have a lot of love for this ecosystem. Um, yeah, as Lena mentioned, I started off this line of inquiry early in February when I came out here to do a research residency with Wasim and the Salon crew. Um, and that has been a sort of exorcism. It's I've been very interested in taking a deeper view into technological infrastructure as a media artist, not only serving up content through mediums and storytelling, which at the time I was doing a lot of ecological and ancestral storytelling through AR, 3D, etc. And then, this year I've been digging more into the accountability and responsibility side of technological infrastructure as it currently is, and then more recently, with leading up to the talk today, I've been looking from a more historical and anthropological um, taking that sort of approach to understand what is our imagination around technology, what are the temporal politics behind it, and and what are alternative worldviews that we can graft onto our contemporary challenges. And so, real quick, the piece that I brought today is a technological grief altar. I find grief to be a really interesting wrench to throw into this mess of meaning making. It's an interesting facilitator that can get us out of our logic-based accounting of what's going on with our technological systems, but it can it's I guess an invitation that I'm extending by bringing this piece to you all today as well in the room that, we might have a lot of feelings about the material and ecological aspects of technology as we try to reckon with that, and also many other losses or things to grieve. Data, locked MySpace accounts, vintage Discmans, mining rigs that we haven't seen ourselves, etc. That's there with some water, the OG conductor of electricity, and some fire as well, to just bring in the spirit side of things. So I'll go ahead with this piece of writing. And some pictures to show you. This is very fresh and raw thinking, or freshly articulated at least, and I would be very curious what surfaces for you and whether it makes sense. I hope to put this piece out soon, but in between now and then, I would love to get your feedback today. So this is a bit of a playtest. All right. That's a picture of the Carboniferous era, our carbon-rich trees and creatures that were alive as what is now present-day fossil fuels. And so, this is the imitation of grief rituals and how we understand these things. Okay, but today I wanted to talk a little bit about Letism. So, part one, the technocratic bind. Just as innovation does not begin with Silicon Valley, the dynamics of the digital age likewise carry forth a lineage of values. Beneath the ever-renewing dream of technological innovation and societal progress is a more familiar story of class, labor, and the struggle for control. In 1989, Ursula Franklin, experimental physicist, gave a series of lectures in which she observes how the house of technology has not gotten more beautiful over time since the Industrial Revolution. Each technological wave of innovation begins by advertising a push of societal progress and individual freedom, but expands into a tool of control that further splits the population into those who do the planning and those who are being planned for. As such, the introduction of mechanical production has witnessed waves of working class protests, the most well-known of which may be the Luddite movement of the 19th century, by British weavers and textile workers. Since subdued by factory owners through legal and military violence, the term Luddite has now taken on a more derogatory connotation these days as someone who is ignorantly adverse to technological progress. And my hunch is that this treatment of working class refusal against a particular strand of technological push simultaneously marks the death, or at least the devaluation, of both craft and critique in the West. So we'll talk a bit about craft later on, but first I'd like to consider the state of critique that we're in now. So mobilization is tricky when the antagonist is not merely the billionaire CEO or the tech office, but the very culture that we're embedded in. In other words, we find ourselves fighting the legacy of the factory owner's idea of innovation. The past century's winners have shaped our story of the future by using their accumulated power to prescribe a Deleuzian puppetry of society. And artists have long been a tool used by the ruling class to shape mass imagination, from Renaissance patronage to Cold War science fiction to modern day gentrification murals and, of course, urban ghostwriters. What makes such cultural influencing especially perilous today, however, is the ever more globalized yet fragmented landscape of societal discourse. Humanity's story-making process is itself watched over by platform algorithms born of neoliberal logic. While paid advertisements prevail alongside a sedating loop of pets and pop music, the voices of sex workers, anti-surveillance activists, and smart city dissidents are drowned out by the sheer weight of noisy content, if not deliberately banned under the threat of community guidelines. As McKinsey work observes in Escape from the Dual Empire, these are not times in which one can speak truth to power. Power has no necessary relation to truth, only to communication, which has no necessary relation to truth whatsoever. Meanwhile, technological planners carry forth a trust us, we know better attitude, championing access as mobility along a condescending framing of knowledge hierarchies. Regarding the implementation of broadband, wireless, or radio connections in rural areas and the periphery of urban centers, a 2018 report on feminist infrastructure states that this usually attends exclusively to commercial interests or aim at simply solving the problem of digital divide through internet access. Meanwhile, beneath the interface, global supply chains comprise of everything from gruesome content moderation labor to the Amazon factory floor, warehouse floor, from the extraction of metals and minerals to the processing of toxic waste. Jussi Parikka covers this a lot more in Geology of Media. The accelerating demands of a digital age shape the techno-feudalist realities of the poor, racialized, and ecological beings who bear the brunt of a very material infrastructural stack. The metaverse is, after all, a place on Earth. The toll adds up. The internet now emits as much carbon as the airline industry in its pre-pandemic numbers. And In such a moment, techno-solutionism also attempts to save itself continuously, and inevitably proves out Mark Fisher's theory of capitalist realism and its fallacy. For example, Web3 projects have spun forth in recent years to try and bring the carbon market on chain toward a global net zero. Yet who buys and who pays? In the case of Region Network, CEO Christian Shearer celebrates their biggest claim by stating, the scale at which Microsoft is purchasing carbon credits should give us all hope that business can and will be a catalyst for change. Merely moving the accounting along the internet stack obscures true reasons for carbon expense, which involves tech incumbents providing AI services to accelerate the fossil fuel industry, for example. And as such, technocracy builds one complicit strategy on top of another, like a house of cards, catapulting public concerns with each hopeful claim while obscuring where accountability remains due. The term media ecology, first developed by Neil Postman and Marshall McLuhan to describe the systemic nature of communication, takes a more true-to-life form in artists Tiga Brain and Sam Levine's work Synthetic Messenger from last year. And in this work, they frame social media as an active force of engineering. They state those who control the media cycle control the carbon cycle. So the work you can check out for yourselves online is something like these like clickbots clicking on a bunch of advertisements online that would hopefully drive more traffic and value to articles online that are that have to do with climate news. This reorientation that they introduce of those who control the media cycle control the carbon cycle centers the earthly externalities of a networked digital age, and with it human actionability as an impaired lever of the livable future. But given the seeming kind of deterministic or the capture of this sort of vantage point from within, I'm actually interested in an inversal challenge. Might we be able to re-relate with technology from an altogether more ecocentric worldview and consider media ecology in that sense? So, can technology be life-affirming, after all? Perhaps it is unsurprising that technological infrastructure, medium, message, and material have become the contemporary grounds for socio-ecological struggle. As Ursula Le Guin puts it, technology has always been our active human interface with the material world. Whether to cultivate food, find shelter, coordinate, or seek pleasure, through technology, we facilitate our earthly relations, and in turn, these tools, practices, and systems that we devise come to reshape these relations, reifying, accelerating, mutating, bricolaging the web of positionalities as a sort of ontological feedback loop, as Arturo Escobar describes here in Designs for the Pluriverse. The power of technology lies here in it being a reflexive medium of worlding with all the potential and dangers of iterating a society's value system onto the psychological and physical space. And the digital age that we're in now imposes a monoculture of sorts on our imagination. Malcolm Ferdinand describes the technology of colonial habitation as a violent way of inhabiting the earth, subjugating lands, humans, and non-humans to the desires of the colonizer, thereby tracing the environmental crisis to the 15th century ideals of enclosure, measure, and optimization of resources that persist through modern day industries. Stefano Harney and Fred Moten describe governance as the extension of whiteness on a global scale, aptly calling into perspective a thread of ambition from imperial rule to the network state. With each rebrand, the future seems ever more stuck under the grasp of capital scene logic. So this command, control, and predict, as well as conquer of the arrow of progress. But how have we come to associate, the network state. How have we come to associate technology with universal future making and to believe that a future exists at all? Temporal politics shape planetary relations, of course. Mining as a global industry operates on stolen time, extracting from centuries-deep sediment and the labor of oppressed bodies to afford the near-term energy demands of distant populations. In contrast, what may be more conducive to regenerative strategies than the cyclical clock? More rhythm than increment. An ancient council of the sun, seasons, and breath continue to bear witness to creature bodies metabolizing and decomposing into each other across intertwining generations of life. As climate disasters lay bare the debt of static jurisdictions upon our Earth, might recalibrating with cyclical affordances be the ultimate prerequisite for human flourishing? So here's where we return to craft. In its contemporary definition, technology is associated more readily with a device rather than the act of devising hardware and software products to be shipped to market at scale. The title of a technologist brings to mind a specialized profession, with the most well-paid developers enclosing their work within proprietary corporations. Tracing the origins of technologies as earthly interfacing, however, we find matrilineal Neolithic ancestors who not only foraged and farmed in flow with the seasons, but tooled, planned, and communicated through natural materials. Anthropologist David Graeber calls this a media revolution, led by women, no less. He says, by plant-based knowledge, we don't just mean new ways of working with wild flora to produce food, spices, medicines, pigments, or poisons. We also mean the development of fiber-based crafts and industries with more abstract forms of knowledge that tend to generate these tend to generate about properties of time, space, and structure. Textiles, basketry, network matting, cordage were most likely also developed in parallel with the cultivation of edible plants, which also implies the development of mathematical and geometrical knowledge that is quite literally intertwined with the practice of these crafts. So while planned obsolescence designs digital equipment to serve a handful of operating system updates, a few years, let's say, only to wind up as toxic e-waste with no prospect of decomposing in a million years. In contrast, many of the baskets that were woven in human civilization have long decayed many times over, that it's hard for archaeologists to even date when the first was made. Meanwhile, the practice of weaving a basket continues to be carried out across present-day cultures. Where is technology exactly? I would argue it exists neither as the basket nor the weaving protocol. Holding a recipe does not make you a chef, and as our beloved Trust Knitting Circle members can attest, just picking up a knitting pattern is a long way to go from being a very adept knitter. But I would say technology exists in the potentiality of weaving a basket that is situated between embodied knowledge and earthly material. This ongoing negotiation between skill through experience and ingenuity through circumstance is ultimately what characterizes our living history as planetary creatures adapting with and by technology through each and every generation. So now, to graft a little bit of Taoist thinking, let's consider the story of the dexterous butcher by the Song Dynasty philosopher Zhuangzi. So in this story, a master butcher, Pao Ding, explains his craft. What I care about is the way. When I first began cutting up oxen, all I could see was the ox itself. After 3 years, I no longer saw the ox. Now I go at it by spirit. And I don't look at it with my eyes. Perception and understanding have come to a stop, while spirit moves where it will, following the natural contours of the ox, guiding the blade through the openings, moving according to form. So I never touch the smallest ligament or tendon, and much less the bone. In this way, Pao Ding keeps his knife of 19 years just as sharp as if it had been lifted from the whetstone. Hong Kong philosopher Ye Kui notes the focus of this story is not so much on techniques, but entirely foundationally on the question of living. If there is a concept of techniques here, he says, it is one that is detached from the technical object. Although the technical object is not without importance, one cannot seek the perfection of techniques through the perfection of a tool or a skill, since perfection can only be accomplished by Tao. As such, a Taoist approach to technology requires a true understanding of technological determination of the knife, while actually freeing the actionability of change. Zhuangzi himself actually lived through the Warring States period in China. This was a period of intense societal turmoil. And in this time, he, I would think, advocated for Taoist, this Taoist philosophy as an easeful strategy that does not hinge on state legibility nor universal frameworks, but is rather honed through skill and spirit in tune with the practical affordances of the earth. And so how do we bring these learnings of our Neolithic ancestors and Taoist philosophers onto contemporary strategies or contemporary challenges and potentially strategies of resistance? Today, our lives have become undeniably algorithmic in predictability, global village and scale, commodified in value, and surveilled in relation to power. But the seemingly inescapable system of the techno-capitalist scene is nonetheless built on one particular understanding of control. A Taoist approach may be especially pertinent under such circumstances. As architect Keller Easterling puts it, on the flip side, where nothing is new and nothing is right, there are no dramatic manifestos. But maybe there is a chance to rehearse a habit of mind that has been eclipsed. Many examples of intervening otherwise, whether in relanguaging that bypasses state censorship or recognizing a forest as a legal entity, or Nima Gatir's idea of harm reduction and applying that to social media use, to community mesh networks across the global majority that first and foremost prioritize collectivist values. These many examples are here to remind us that, in fact, a monoculture of imagination is just as susceptible as a tired field of corn.